They say the jungle remembers what the world forgets. And in the heart of South America, wrapped in vines and shadowed by canopies, there's a story so strange, so unrelenting, that even time couldn't silence it. It begins with three men, one father, one son, one friend, all three driven by the same dream, a city carved in stone, older than empires, rich beyond comprehension, and lost to the world for centuries. They entered the rainforest and were never seen again. But what if they weren't chasing gold? What if they were chasing something even more valuable, something buried so deep it could change how we understand human history itself? To unravel this mystery, we must go back to the man at the center of it all. His name was Percy Fawcett. In the spring of 1906, Percy Harrison Fawcett stood before a room filled with scholars and mapmakers. The Royal Geographical Society had summoned him not just for his charm or military service, but because he was one of the few men alive capable of surviving what lay ahead. At 39, Fawcett was already remarkable. A decorated artillery officer, a veteran of Morocco, and an elite surveyor trained to determine his location anywhere on Earth using the stars, the sun, and his compass alone. He wasn't just a soldier or a scientist. He was a man torn between the rational and the mystical, between the precision of his instruments and the echo of something deeper, something ancient. The Bolivian government needed someone to chart the border it shared with Brazil, a task as dangerous as it was daunting. And Fawcett didn't hesitate. His family motto was "Difficulties be damned." And true to those words, he packed his bags. He left behind his wife, Nina, and their young son Jack. She was pregnant with their second child. He kissed her hand, looked into her eyes, and told her that fate had already chosen. From the moment his ship cut across the Atlantic, Fawcett felt a strange pull toward the land he was about to enter. The Amazon wasn't just a jungle, it was a living entity. Its breath was heavy, its silence deceptive, but it whispered things, old things, things that refused to die. As a boy growing up on the Devon coast, Fawcett had stumbled upon Roman remains in a seaside cave. The discovery electrified him. It made him feel as though he'd touched another world. That moment never left him. Instead, it burned inside his chest like a compass magnetized by mystery. Years later, as he stepped foot in the thick vegetation of Brazil, the same feeling returned, only stronger. He hadn't just come to draw borders. He had come to listen to what the jungle was trying to say. The assignment lasted years. Between 1906 and 1911, Fawcett made expedition after expedition into the rainforest, pushing deeper each time. He encountered unbearable heat, biting insects, deadly fevers, and at times starvation. One trip saw half his team collapse from malaria within days. Another ended with Fawcett single-handedly saving a guide from drowning in a flash flood. But he kept going, because with each journey, the whispers got louder. Indigenous guides and river traders shared fragments of stories passed down through generations. Tales of stone cities hidden deep within the green, places where the rivers forked and the canopy opened to the sky. These weren't just superstitions. The stories were often detailed. Roads built with precision, towers that gleamed in the sun, people with strange customs who vanished long ago. Fawcett listened. He recorded everything. Unlike other explorers who dismissed native stories as fantasy, he considered them pieces of a puzzle. And slowly, that puzzle began to take shape. It was then that Fawcett first heard mention of a lost civilization that once thrived beyond the horizon. A place not made of myth, but of brick and stone. A city whose people had carved their legacy into the earth, only to be swallowed whole by the vines of time. He didn't have a name for it yet, but he believed it was real. And he wasn't the only one. In 1541, a Spanish conquistador named Francisco de Orellana had traveled the Amazon in search of a rumored kingdom of gold. His chronicles described vast populations along the river, villages of tens of thousands, roads heading into the interior, and people wearing robes of feather and jewelry. He claimed to have seen cities that shimmered like fire under the tropical sun. When those accounts reached Europe, they were ridiculed. Most believed the Amazon soil was too poor to support such societies. The jungle, they said, could not sustain cities. But Fawcett wasn't so sure. In fact, he believed Orellana's journals were accurate. He thought the Spanish explorer had seen something real, something we had failed to understand. Then came the discovery that changed everything. While poring over documents in Rio de Janeiro's National Archives, Fawcett came across a crumbling manuscript labeled simply as 512. It had no author. Time had stripped away its name, but its story remained. The text spoke of a Portuguese expedition in the 1700s. The group, led by a man Fawcett later dubbed Raposo, claimed to have stumbled upon a deserted city in the jungle. According to the manuscript, they followed a man-made trail up a ridge and found, laid before them, a stunning vista. Rows of stone buildings, a grand plaza, a black column standing tall in the center. They entered the city with awe and fear. The homes were empty. There were no signs of life, no furniture, no tools, nothing but the cold, carved reminders of a people who had once thrived. Fawcett devoured the account. To him, this wasn't just a story. It was a clue, and he became convinced that Raposo City and the cities Orellana had glimpsed centuries earlier were one and the same. This was the moment Z was born. He didn't call it El Dorado. That name, he thought, had been cheapened by greedy treasure hunters. To him, this was something more profound, something sacred. So he called it Z, the last letter, the final mystery. In letters to his youngest son Brian, Fawcett described what he believed Z would look like. He imagined a city nestled in a wide valley, surrounded by high mountains. At its center, an elevated acropolis approached by a stone roadway. The architecture, he said, would be more ancient than any Egyptian ruin. The people who had lived there, he wrote, likely used a form of writing linked to ancient Asian and European scripts. It wasn't gold he was chasing. It was history itself. But Fawcett's belief in Z wasn't just scientific. It was spiritual. His mother, a devout spiritualist, had raised him to believe in hidden truths, in wisdom that lived outside the material world. His wife Nina practiced astrology. His brother was a prominent member of a movement that studied ancient esoteric knowledge and claimed that enlightened masters lived in remote places, guiding humanity in secret. To Percy Fawcett, the jungle wasn't just geography. It was prophecy. He believed that in Z, he would not only find evidence of a forgotten people, but perhaps meet those who carried ancient wisdom, guardians of lost knowledge, untouched by modern decay. His passion became obsession. He resigned from official surveying. He poured all his energy into finding this city. The war temporarily pulled him away, but it couldn't smother the fire. When the war ended, he returned home with medals pinned to his chest and eyes still fixed on the rainforest. But there was a problem. He had no money, and the world had moved on. The war had taken its toll on Britain. It returned a nation scarred, grieving and broke. In this new world of ration books and economic ruin, few had the appetite or the funds for grand expeditions into South America. Percy Fawcett, once celebrated, now found himself regarded as eccentric, even mad. His belief in the lost city of Z seemed increasingly out of place in a world obsessed with industry and recovery. The Royal Geographical Society, though once his champion, grew skeptical. Academics dismissed his theories as fanciful. Soil experts argued that the Amazon couldn't support large-scale agriculture, let alone cities. Archaeologists scowled at his maps and manuscripts. But Fawcett would not let go. He spent the early 1920s writing, lecturing, begging. He met with publishers, spoke at universities, and courted scientific institutions across Europe and America. He framed Z not as a myth, but as a missing chapter in human history, a key to understanding who we once were and what we might still become. He told his audiences that Z wasn't just a ruin. It was the culmination of a vast, forgotten civilization, more advanced in some ways than our own. And that somewhere out there, untouched by colonizers or corruption, it still endured. His words were compelling, and slowly interest returned. In 1920, with limited backing, Fawcett returned to the Amazon. This journey would haunt him. Heavy rains destroyed their equipment. Disease swept through his crew. One of his companions descended into madness. Another abandoned him entirely. Starving, exhausted, and utterly alone, Fawcett was forced to end the expedition. He dubbed the place of his failure Dead Horse Camp, in memory of the animal he had to shoot when it could no longer walk. But to Fawcett, it also represented something else, a line between what had been attempted and what must still be done. When he returned to England, he was a man changed. Though physically weakened, his belief in Z had only grown stronger. He told his wife Nina that the clues were aligning, that he now knew the location of the city. He just needed one final chance. But raising money proved harder than ever. He approached American museums, private benefactors, even newspapers. Slowly, support began to trickle in. One of the first to commit was the Museum of the American Indian, followed by the American Geographical Society. They pledged a few $1,000s, barely enough to cover basic costs. Still, it was something. Fawcett knew he would have to turn to something more public, something bold. So he made a deal with the National American Newspaper Alliance, an organization with outlets in nearly every city in the United States. Fawcett proposed a radical idea. He would send dispatches from the jungle via native runners. The reports would be serialized, turning the expedition into a real-time adventure followed by readers around the world. The newspapers agreed. Suddenly, Fawcett's quest was no longer just a scientific endeavor. It was a global event, a mystery unfolding before the eyes of millions. He had turned his expedition into something that felt like a race, a drama, even a prophecy. Other papers followed suit. Soon, his face appeared in headlines across the United Kingdom, the United States, France, and Brazil. He was once again a household name, celebrated, mocked, and debated in equal measure. But not everyone shared his enthusiasm. In scientific circles, doubts continued to grow. Critics pointed out that the Amazon's red-yellow soil was acidic and poor in nutrients. They claimed that even with advanced methods, it could never sustain populations the size Fawcett envisioned. They believed the jungle to be a green desert, deadly and empty. But Percy had seen things they hadn't. He had walked on patches of soil that defied those assumptions. Dark, rich earth filled with shards of pottery and bone. Soil the locals called terra preta, black earth. Soil, he believed, made by human hands. He suspected it was the secret, proof that someone had learned how to tame the jungle. And if they had, then Z was not only possible, it was inevitable. But belief alone wasn't enough. He needed a team. And this time, he chose carefully. His closest ally was his own son, Jack Fawcett. At 21, Jack was strong, intelligent, and fiercely loyal to his father. He had inherited Percy's determination, and more importantly, shared his dream. Jack had grown up on his father's stories, imagining Z as more than a city, as a destiny they would uncover together. With Jack came his childhood friend, Raleigh Rimmel. A gentle, curious man in his 20s, Raleigh lacked experience, but possessed something equally vital: absolute trust. Fawcett knew the risks. The jungle had taken so many already: explorers, missionaries, soldiers, traders. Some disappeared. Some were killed. Others returned broken. But Percy believed that a smaller group might succeed where larger parties had failed. 3 men, unburdened by noise or baggage, could move silently, respectfully, could go where others never reached. He warned them. The expedition would be perilous. They would be cut off from the world for months. If anything went wrong, help would be impossible. They must accept the possibility that they might never return. Jack and Raleigh agreed. Nina, Percy's wife, struggled with the decision. She had already given so much. Years spent raising children alone, countless nights waiting for word, enduring rumors and ridicule. Now, she would send both her husband and her son into the unknown. But she believed in them. And more than that, she believed in the dream. By early 1925, preparations were underway. Fawcett gathered maps, journals, supplies. He studied weather patterns and tribal territories. He estimated the journey would take up to a year. If successful, they would uncover one of the greatest archaeological discoveries in history. If not, they would vanish like so many before. On January 29, 1925, Percy, Jack, and Raleigh departed from New York, bound for Brazil. The world watched. The ship carrying Percy Fawcett, his son Jack, and Raleigh Rimmel docked in Rio de Janeiro under a haze of tropical heat. They were greeted not with fanfare, but with stares, journalists, skeptics, and believers alike hoping to catch a glimpse of the trio who dared to chase legends. From Rio, they began their 1,000-mile journey inland, by train, by boat, and eventually by mule, moving steadily toward the unmarked forests of the Mato Grosso. Their final destination, the upper Xingu River, where Fawcett believed Z would be found. It was there, according to his calculations, that the lost city lay, surrounded by mountains, veiled in mist, waiting. By April 20, 1925, they had reached a place Fawcett called the stepping-off point, the edge of the unknown. Beyond lay a realm untouched by maps or time. From that day forward, they would rely only on instinct, experience, and each other. Their route began where Fawcett's previous expedition had faltered, Dead Horse Camp. He had named it after being forced to shoot his own horse there years earlier. Now, it became their last point of contact with the outside world. Each day, they hacked through thick vegetation, guided by local scouts for a time. They followed rivers upstream, crossed plains beneath suffocating sun, and braved the swarms of biting flies that rose like fog at dawn. By night, they slept in hammocks strung between trees, surrounded by the endless rasp of insects and the distant, guttural cries of howler monkeys. Fawcett kept meticulous notes, though official reports for the newspapers were sent back via native runners. His personal letters told a different story, a more fragile truth. In one letter, he confessed that Raleigh's foot had become badly infected. It slowed their pace and raised concerns. The young man refused to turn back. He had come too far. Fawcett, always cautious with outsiders, wrote to Nina privately. He admitted concern. He told her Jack was healthy, spirits high, and that the expedition was going as planned. But there was a line in his letter that stood out, a quiet premonition. "I cannot hope to stand up better than the boys," he wrote. "My years are telling." Yet his tone remained defiant. You need have no fear of any failure. That letter, passed to a guide and sent by runner, would be the last the world ever heard from him. After May 29, 1925, silence. No more letters. No more reports. No signals. No sightings. Nothing. They had vanished. Weeks passed. Then months. Then years. Back in England, Nina refused to grieve. She believed in Percy's promise. She imagined him safe, perhaps living among the very people he had sought. She clung to his words, repeating them like prayer. "Any day now," she told friends. "Any day he'll return." The newspapers were less forgiving. Headlines turned from admiration to doubt. Had they been killed by hostile tribes? Had they succumbed to illness or starvation? Or worse, had the entire expedition been a delusion? Rumors flooded in. Some claimed to have seen white men in remote villages. Others swore they'd found clues, discarded equipment, a boot print, a bone. A few even declared Fawcett had found Z and chosen never to return, living in secret with a lost tribe. The jungle was vast, and it guarded its secrets well. Over the years, dozens of search parties were launched. Some were official, funded by governments or institutions. Others were freelance, adventurers, treasure hunters, mystics. Many never returned. Some died. Others came back empty-handed, haunted by the green silence. In 1928, a Swiss explorer named George Diet attempted to trace Fawcett's last known path. He interviewed local tribes who spoke of 3 white men passing through their territory. But the trails went cold. Diet returned with no definitive answers. As the decades passed, interest rose and fell in waves. Fawcett's legend grew with each generation. He became a symbol, the last true explorer, a man who chased a dream into oblivion. But Nina never gave up. 10 years after his disappearance, she still waited for him. She kept his things untouched. She lit candles on his birthday. In her letters, she spoke of him in the present tense. Some called it denial. Others saw something deeper, a connection unbroken by time or distance. Then came a strange twist. In 1951, a man named Orlando Villas-Boas, a respected Brazilian explorer and protector of indigenous rights, claimed he had interviewed tribes near the Xingu. According to them, the group had indeed encountered Fawcett's party. The men were welcomed at first, but later something went wrong. Possibly a misunderstanding, possibly a perceived insult. In this account, Fawcett, Jack, and Raleigh were killed. But there was no evidence, no bodies, no artifacts. Only a story, passed from one mouth to another, softened and reshaped by time. Back in England, the Fawcett family refused to accept it. Years passed. Generations shifted. The world changed. But the question remained, what happened to Percy Fawcett and his companions? Had they been betrayed? Had they starved in silence? Had they found what they were looking for and chosen to stay? No one knows. What we do know is that they were last seen walking into the jungle with machetes on their hips, rifles slung over their shoulders, and notebooks packed with dreams. And that they were never seen again. In the days and months following Percy Fawcett's disappearance, silence settled like fog over the world that once followed his every move. Newspapers printed updates out of obligation, often quoting old letters or second-hand reports. But nothing concrete ever came. With each week, the headlines grew smaller. Public curiosity faded. Soon, only Nina was left, waiting at the window, scanning the horizon for a cable, a knock, a letter. What she received instead was speculation. Rumors drifted in from the jungle, each more bizarre than the last. A tribal elder claimed the men had been turned into spirits. Another told of white ghosts haunting a river bend near where Fawcett was last seen. One story, perhaps the cruelest, insisted that Fawcett had gone mad, killed his companions, and wandered into the trees alone. Nina dismissed them all. She believed her husband had found what he was looking for, Z, and that for reasons beyond comprehension, he had chosen to stay. She spoke often of this, that Percy had transcended his time, his mission, that Z wasn't just ruins or gold, but a place of peace and truth, a sanctuary from the modern world. She kept every letter he ever wrote. Their home became a shrine of paper and ink and silence. Their children, Brian and Joan, grew up beneath the long shadow of his absence. Jack, the boy who had disappeared beside him, was memorialized in stories and sketches, never allowed to age. For decades, Nina refused to declare them dead. Even when urged by government officials, by extended family, by the passing of time itself, she resisted. As long as no bodies were found, no truth confirmed, she would not bury her hope. But others sought answers through action. Beginning in the late 1920s, a series of expeditions launched with one goal: find Fawcett. Some were organized by universities. Others were funded by newspapers looking for a sensational scoop. And a few came from people who simply couldn't let go of the mystery. One of the earliest was the ill-fated mission led by Major George Diet in 1928. An experienced aviator and adventurer, Diet claimed he had traced Fawcett's last route. He even said he had spoken with tribes who admitted to killing 3 white men. The world braced for confirmation. But Diet returned with no physical evidence. No bones. No journal. No rifle. Just more hearsay. His expedition, though widely reported, was ultimately inconclusive. That didn't stop others. Over the following decades, more than a dozen official and unofficial search missions were launched. Some vanished themselves. Others came back broken, ravaged by disease, battered by terrain, or shaken by what they'd encountered. A few recovered artifacts they claimed belonged to Fawcett's team, but nothing could be proven. And so the myth grew. Fawcett became a ghost, a figure caught between history and legend, walking forever in the minds of those who followed. Writers published books about him. Filmmakers dreamed of adapting his life. Some painted him as a hero, others as a deluded mystic. But all agreed on one thing: he was the last of a dying breed. There was something about the nature of his disappearance that captured the imagination. He hadn't just died. He had vanished into a place that resists discovery, where the trees swallow time and the ground hides its dead. In the 1950s, nearly 30 years after he vanished, a glimmer of truth surfaced. Brazilian explorer Orlando Villas-Boas, a man deeply respected for his work with indigenous communities, shared a startling claim. According to members of a tribe near the Xingu, Fawcett's party had indeed passed through their territory. They had been peaceful, respectful, and were even welcomed. But something changed. One version suggested Raleigh offended the tribe by urinating near sacred ground. Another said they refused to share food. Yet another claimed they were mistaken for enemy invaders. Whatever the reason, the story ended the same. The three men were killed. Villas-Boas believed it. He said the account was too consistent across too many people to be fiction. But even he admitted there were no remains, no proof. Nina refused to believe it. She clung to the idea that Percy had found a people who had chosen secrecy for their survival. A society so advanced, so self-contained, they had no need or desire to return to the world. And that perhaps Percy, Jack, and Raleigh had stayed, not because they failed, but because they had finally found what they were looking for. When Nina died in 1954, she had still not declared Percy legally dead. She passed away with a framed photo of him beside her bed and his last letter folded under her pillow. It would take another decade before the family finally accepted the loss, more for legal closure than emotional release. By then, Percy Fawcett was no longer just a man. He had become something else. An idea. A symbol of the ultimate quest. Of obsession, perseverance, and the thin, crumbling line between genius and madness. He represented the explorer's curse, that the more you seek, the further you drift from the world you left behind. For decades, the Amazon was considered an ecological paradox. On the surface, it appeared abundant, lush, green, and teeming with life. But beneath its roots, the soil was poor, acidic, depleted, and incapable of sustaining long-term agriculture. That was the accepted truth. And that truth was used to dismiss Percy Fawcett. If a land couldn't grow food, how could it have supported cities of stone, temples, roads, and tens of thousands of people? It was nonsense, scholars said. Romantic at best, dangerous at worst. But the jungle holds secrets. And one by one, they began to emerge. In the early 2000s, as satellite imaging technology improved, archaeologists and researchers began to peer beneath the green. What they found shocked them. Beneath dense tree canopies in the western Amazon, specifically in regions not far from where Fawcett disappeared, were strange geometric patterns etched into the ground. Circles, squares, long, straight lines running for miles. At first, they were thought to be natural, but then more appeared, hundreds. These weren't random. They were the remnants of ditches, causeways, and foundations, evidence of deliberate, large-scale land modification. And they spanned thousands of square miles. Suddenly, what Fawcett had claimed decades ago didn't seem so outlandish. Then came the discovery that changed everything. Terra Preta. Translated from Portuguese as Black Earth, Terra Preta was unlike any other soil in the Amazon. Rich, dark, and incredibly fertile. It didn't match the native yellow-red clay that defined the region. At first, researchers thought it was natural. But deeper analysis revealed the truth. It was man-made. Terra Preta was created by ancient Amazonian peoples. How? By mixing clay soil with organic waste, charcoal, bones, compost, fish scraps, pottery shards, and plant matter. The result was a regenerative soil that retained nutrients, resisted erosion, and could support intensive agriculture. Even more astonishing, it was self-renewing. Some scientists believe this black earth was engineered more than 2,500 years ago, and it's still productive today. Fawcett had noticed patches of rich soil during his expeditions. He had written of pottery fragments embedded in the ground, of dark earth that yielded dense vegetation, and of locals who spoke of old fields where the ancestors once lived. But back then, no one listened. Now researchers realized what he had seen. These weren't just odd patches. They were the foundations of lost cities, real civilizations that had figured out how to transform the jungle into something livable, even abundant. As archaeological teams began excavating the Terra Preta regions, they found more than fertile soil. They found roads, bridges, ceremonial structures, and living spaces, all hidden beneath centuries of forest. In the Beni region of Bolivia, vast forest islands emerged, raised mounds where people once lived, surrounded by canals, dikes, and reservoirs. In Brazil, near the Xingu River, scientists uncovered a vast urban network. Dozens of settlements connected by straight roads, some flanked by towering walls of earth. These cities weren't random. They were planned, built with symmetry, drainage systems, and zoning. There were public spaces, ritual platforms, and signs of organized governance. Some settlements stretched over hundreds of acres. And they were old, many predating European contact by centuries. Carbon dating pushed their origins back, well, before the time of Fawcett's expeditions, and even before Machu Picchu. And they weren't isolated. Taken together, these findings painted a staggering picture. Between the 10th and 15th centuries, the Amazon may have been home to millions of people. Not scattered tribes, but complex, interlinked civilizations with agriculture, social hierarchies, and spiritual traditions. Fawcett had theorized this based on indigenous testimony and colonial documents. He was right about the traditions. He was right about the settlements. He was even right about their location. One of the largest regions of Terra Preta and geometric structures lies just 100 miles from where Percy Fawcett vanished in 1925. The implications are monumental. It means that the Western world erased an entire chapter of human history, that we labeled a thriving civilization as myth simply because we didn't understand it, and because its people didn't leave pyramids or marble, but earthworks and soil. What happened to these civilizations? The answer, tragically, is clear. When European explorers first arrived in the Amazon in the 1500s, they brought something deadlier than swords or guns: disease. Smallpox, measles, and influenza swept through communities like wildfire. Within a generation, over 90% of the indigenous population was gone. Without people to maintain them, cities vanished. Roads crumbled. Fields returned to jungle. Nature took back what had been built. So when later explorers arrived, Fawcett included, they found emptiness. The ruins were buried. The forests had erased the evidence. Only stories remained. And yet, stories were enough. Because Fawcett listened. He didn't dismiss oral history. He recorded it. He mapped it. He gave it weight. And now science is catching up. Modern researchers have called for a reassessment of how we view the Amazon, not as an untouched wilderness, but as a cultural forest, a landscape shaped by human hands for millennia. Not conquered, but cultivated. This is the real legacy of the lost city of Z. It wasn't a place made of gold. It was a world built on knowledge. The knowledge of how to live with nature, not against it. Of how to thrive without destroying. Of how to build, not in stone, but in soil. And perhaps this was the treasure Percy Fawcett was really chasing. Not something that glitters. Something that grows. The jungle never gave back Percy Fawcett. No body was ever found. No bones. No journal. No machete. No compass. Nothing but stories. And the stories never stopped. Some say he was killed, speared by hostile warriors, mistaken for an invader. Others believe he starved, lost in the maze of rivers and roots. A few cling to the idea that he found Z and chose to stay, that he walked into a new world and disappeared by choice, not by force. But the truth is likely more tragic and more profound. Fawcett wasn't just chasing a city. He was chasing a possibility. He believed, long before anyone else dared to, that the Amazon was not an empty expanse, but a place of memory, a living library, a hidden network of knowledge, buried under centuries of silence. Today, we know he was right. The discoveries of Terra Preta, the vast networks of roads and settlements, and the oral traditions passed down through generations all point to what Fawcett felt in his bones. That civilization had once flourished there, and we had simply forgotten it. He didn't have the language of satellite imagery or carbon dating. He didn't have drones or academic grants. He had a notebook, a compass, and a fire in his chest that refused to go out. And he had a willingness to believe, to trust the wisdom of those the world had ignored. In that sense, Fawcett wasn't just an explorer of land. He was an explorer of truth. He stood at the edge of science and spirit, of evidence and intuition. His mother taught him to believe in the unseen. His training taught him to measure the known. Between the two, he forged a path that neither fully embraced him nor fully understood him. That path took everything: his career, his health, his family, his son. But maybe, just maybe, it gave something back. Because Percy Fawcett's story, unlike so many buried beneath the jungle floor, survived. It survived the ridicule of scholars, the silence of officials, the passing of empires. It inspired books, movies, novels, and academic debates. It stirred the imaginations of generations who dreamed not of gold, but of discovery. And it helped push science to look where it once refused to, under the trees, in the soil, in the stories told by people who had no paper, no pen, only memory. What makes his story endure isn't just mystery, it's meaning. Fawcett represents something all too rare today: the willingness to go all in for something bigger than yourself. To risk ridicule, loss, and death for the chance that the world might be more than we think. He wasn't perfect. He was stubborn. He took foolish risks. He romanticized the past. He sometimes believed too much in himself and not enough in those around him. But he believed. And belief, when mixed with discipline, courage, and fire, can move mountains. That's what he tried to do. And, in a way, he succeeded. Not by finding Z, but by reminding us that Z may still be out there. Not just in the jungle, but in the hidden corners of our own history. In the records we haven't read. In the questions we're still afraid to ask. Was Z a city? Maybe. Was it a people? Likely. But more than anything, Z was a possibility. The possibility that we are not the pinnacle, but part of a cycle. That advanced civilizations have risen and fallen long before we ever drew maps. That deep in the rainforest, long before Europe ever sailed west, there were minds building things we're only now beginning to rediscover. That we're not the first to know how to live with the land, rather than in defiance of it. And that sometimes the greatest treasures aren't made of gold, but of memory, ingenuity, and soil. When Percy Fawcett vanished, he left behind no relics. Only a question that echoes through vines, across rivers under stone. What if we've been wrong about the past? The answer lies out there still, under the leaves, beneath the roots, carried in the wind, waiting. Subscribe to Past Unveiled for more videos like these.